Hi, let's take another look at a book that I have done before in a podcast. It's Mark D. Roberts. He wrote, Can We Trust the Gospels? Subtitle, Investigating the Reliability of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, thanks for joining me today. This is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I like Mark Roberts. I think the thing that I enjoy the most is he's very easy to read, and maybe I should add something else. He's very careful. He doesn't make extravagant claims. So I think that's really good to know. Just to give you some ideas, Hugh Hewitt, he's a radio talk show host. He says it's the best effort I've ever read by a serious scholar to communicate what scholars know about the Gospels and why that should indeed encourage us to trust them and thus to trust Jesus Christ. Okay, so I've done a couple of previous ones. One was on looking at some of the manuscript evidence. You know, do we have good manuscript evidence? Looked at oral tradition. He spent a chapter talking about that probably these stories about Jesus were orally transmitted before they were written down, which can make people a little nervous, but he explained why that was not a problem. I'd like to go to chapter 11. And this is something that a lot of people, the minute they hear of Jesus walking on water or Jesus healing people or turning water to wine or whatever, they go, nah, I don't think so. And it comes back often to the idea of miracles. So chapter 11 is titled, Do Miracles Undermine the Reliability of the Gospels? And I really like the fact that Mark, he starts off saying, I'm a natural-born skeptic, I admit it. He said, when I hear some Christian claim that miracles happen, he says, my first impulse isn't to rejoice, but to doubt. He said, I do think miracles happen, but he said he's aware that people exaggerate or they get deceived or something like that. So he said in college, he was a philosophy major, and he wrote on argument against miracles that David Hume put forth, which I think is interesting that he'd tackle that. He didn't refute Hume's arguments. He just tried to go through what Hume's had to say. And what Hume's was trying to get across was that the case for miracles is extremely weak given the nature of the miraculous. So Mark Roberts says, if you tell me, for example, you turned invisible at work today, I'm not going to believe you. I don't have any experience of people becoming invisible. I do have experience of people deceiving themselves or trying to deceive me. So he said, I'm kind of like David Hume. I'd find deception more likely than invisibility. So Roberts says, I do have that skepticism, but he said, I don't think the presence of miracle stories in the Gospels makes them unreliable. He said it does complicate things when you're trying to look at the historicity. He said you'd find a lot more people willing to accept the historical reliability of the Gospels if they didn't have these miracles that were in there. He said, but of course, if there are no miracles, there'd be no New Testament Gospels. There'd be no New Testament at all. The narratives of Jesus' ministry are filled with supernatural events. So he spends the whole chapter covering 7 points concerning miracles. So he said, I'm just scratching the surface. He said, if you want more in-depth stuff, take a look at other books. So he mentioned a couple of other books, and I'll just throw them out there for you if you want to really go into depth about miracles. Craig Blomberg, he's a very careful scholar. He wrote The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. You might take a look at that. Doug Geivett, that's Geivett, and Gary Habermas wrote In Defense of Miracles. And then a man named Graham Twelftree, Twelftree, wrote a book called Jesus the Miracle Worker. So those are ones that you can look at. So here we go. Here are the 7 theses, he says, concerning miracles in the gospel. So number 1, your belief about God impacts your evaluation of the miracles in the Gospels. He said, I'm a theist. He said, I do believe that there's at least a theoretical possibility. I believe there's a supreme being, some all-powerful being out there, and if he wants to, he can do things within his creation that are extraordinary. So if that's the case, then miracles can happen. Of course, Robert says, now, if you're not a theist, you don't believe in the possibility of miracles, then you have to reject the Gospels. Right? They're gone. They're not going to be useful to you. Number 2, miracles do not contradict science. I think that's crucial. He said a lot of people claim miracles can't occur. They're contrary to science. But he said, miracles are outside of science. They don't contradict science. Why? Well, science studies natural events, but miracles, by definition, are not natural. They're supernatural. So science doesn't really have anything to say about them. So I think that's crucial to say that. So he said, scientific rejection of miracles is just a matter of faith more than reason. He said there are many theistic scientists who believe that miracles can happen. Yeah, I think there are a lot of good ones. Again, we can cover that in another podcast sometime. Let's go to his third point. A worldview that has supernatural powers makes the best sense of some of life's mysteries. He said there have been all sorts of bizarre events that have gone on. He said certain kinds of phenomena are best explained because of supernatural beings, both good and evil. He said, it could be demonic things, but also angelic beings. And by the way, as far as the explaining life's mysteries, you might take a look at another book. I think it's just called Miracles, and it's by Eric Metaxas. So that's a good one because Eric spends time talking about friends of his and things that have happened to them that fall way out of natural occurrences. Then there's a book called Miracles in America Today, I think is the title. Don't hold me to that, but there are other really good books that explore miracles. I think Lee Strobel has a book on the case for miracles. So anyway, he says, this is his third point. He says a worldview that at least would allow for supernatural powers makes the best sense of some of life's mysteries. And he tells a story, and I wanted to share this story with you because I love it, to show miracles happening in his life. He said when he was a sophomore in college, he wanted to share his Christian faith, but he was kind of an introvert. So he didn't want to go up to a friend and get a conversation going about God. So he asked God really seriously to help him. And he was in Harvard Square and walking around late October, kind of a cool evening, and he was just praying that he would be allowed to share his faith with somebody. And he said he thought that'd be a good place for God to drop somebody into his lap. So he prayed earnestly, God, guide me to someone that I could talk to openly about Christianity. God, he said, I'm shy. So if you could work a little miracle here and find somebody that I could share with and make it obvious, that would be so helpful. So he walked around there wondering who that person is. God, please bring me somebody who wants to learn about you. Nothing happened. A half hour went by. Then two young women came up. Hey, we're going to a party at Dunster House. We don't know how to get there. Could you help us? Oh, sure, I said, glad to. So he's thinking to himself, man, this is great. God brought these people into my life. I can talk to them, and they're two good-looking women. How good is this? So he had about 10 minutes with the women as he's walking to this house, and on the way, he kept bringing up subjects that he knew would lead to a conversation about God. I'm majoring in philosophy, he said. Are you interested in philosophy? No. Sometimes I wonder why we're here on this earth. Do you ever think about this? They didn't. He realized after a few more minutes and talking to them, they were just going to the house, the Dunster House. I don't know what that is, maybe a sorority or something. They just wanted to party. They didn't want to do anything about the meaning of life. He said he tried over and over different ways to get to a conversation about God. Nothing happened. He said out of all these students wandering around, he said they've got to have been the least interested in God. So he got to the door of the house, walked them in. They said, thanks, and they went inside. So Robert said, boy, I felt like a complete idiot. He said, okay, God. He said, I get the point. You probably had a good chuckle over my silliness. Well, I'm going home. This is a stupid idea. So he's heading back to his dorm. And as he was on his way, he passed a student. There was a friend of a friend, didn't really know him. He said, hi. So Robert said, hi. And they're going off in different directions. And all of a sudden, this guy stopped. He turned around. He said, hey, are you Mark Roberts? Yeah. Well, I'm Matt. I'm a friend of your roommate, Bob. Oh, yeah. Hello, Matt. I've been wanting to talk to you, Matt said. Me? I asked. Robert said, me? Why me? Well, because I hear you're a Christian. I need to talk to you about God. How is that? So there a conversation started, went clear into the night, and said it ended up a weekly Bible study. He said when they got done, he said he really wasn't sure. Matt didn't give his life to Christ, but he was closer to doing that than when they met each other. He said, end of story. So isn't that a fascinating story? Now, how would you explain that? Well, we're back to Robert's third point. A worldview that includes supernatural powers makes the best sense of life's mystery. He said he's had so many bizarre things happen in his life, so wonderful. He said, I just can't account for them apart from belief in a benevolent, miracle-working God. And he mentions that story about the guy that he ran into. I love that one. Okay, here's his fourth point about miracles. The parallels to the miracles of Jesus found outside the Bible don't undermine the authenticity of the New Testament. He said, in fact, they usually support the reliability of the gospel story. So he says, go back to the literature of the Hellenistic world. So he said people in the Greco-Roman world told all sorts of amazing stories, like Apologist. He was a wonder-working philosopher. And the story is that maybe the early Christians were aware of these tales, and they wanted to invent stories about Jesus. So it'd be kind of like these Hellenistic superheroes. And Robert said, now that at the start sounds pretty solid, but he said, it's full of holes. He said, for one thing, most of the stories of these miracles in pagan religions were way more fantastic and removed from everyday experience. I mean, Hercules slayed a multi-headed monster. Jesus didn't do that. He says, moreover, these pagan miracles were often told in an exaggerated, entertaining style, but Jesus' miracles are understated. In fact, you even get like Mark 5:3, the Gospels record a time when Jesus lacked supernatural knowledge or power. That's in Mark 6, first 6 verses. There are some other instances where he tried some exorcism, as Mark 5, 1 through 8. He tried healing, Mark 8, 22 to 26, and those things didn't work first and then did later on. He said, if early Christians are going to make up miracle stories about Jesus, boy, they could have done a better job, both in content and in the form. So they would have tidied up their stories. But they didn't. They had the stories of Jesus that way. He said the whole pagan influence idea forgets that the first Christians were not Gentiles competing with Hercules and Apollonius. They were Jews. They believed Jesus was Israel's Messiah. So the oral traditions about Jesus' miracles come out of a Jewish culture. If the stories of Jesus' miracles had been fabricated by the first Christians, they wouldn't use pagan models. They might use, Old Testament examples like the miracles of Moses or Elijah. And then Mark Roberts doesn't mention this, but let me throw in one more thought. They've done a lot of study of these pagan, miracle workers and things like that, and many of the tales are later than those of Jesus. So, who influenced whom? Maybe it was the Jesus stories that influenced the others. Okay, so let's go to point 5 here. When it comes to reasons for accepting the gospel miracles as historically accurate, the resurrection leads the way. He said, it doesn't make sense to argue that any one of the Jesus miracles was solely responsible for the rise of Christianity, except for the resurrection. You take away the resurrection, and you're going to have a heck of a time trying to make sense of the origins of Christianity. I mean, think about it. Jesus dies this horrible, shameful death. Nobody in his time, other than Jesus, had any place for a suffering, dying Messiah. And after Jesus died, his disciples were devastated. They were frightened. They were hiding out. But then just a short time later, they became a fearless band of evangelists. They ended up just tearing throughout the world and changing the course of history. And what was their message? That crucified Jesus was Israel's Messiah. And all of this was set upon one conviction. Jesus had been raised from the dead. He was not a resuscitated corpse, and he was not a symbol of spiritual rebirth, but he was a living Lord. So what explains this crazy rise, this flash of early Christianity? The resurrection. The resurrection. He said, in my opinion, all efforts to explain why these defeated disciples became enthusiastic evangelists fall short, apart from the resurrection. He said, the simplest, the most elegant, and the most compelling account of the start of Christianity rests upon this amazing miracle. Now, he mentions a book, said a good exposition of this point is N.T. Wright's book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. Yeah, that's a good one. Personally, I really like the Gary Habermas book about the resurrection of Jesus. And so look up Habermas, just amazing author and good historian and researcher. So he said, I'm back to now to Roberts, why would a natural born skeptic, he said, like himself, believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead? He said, because it offers the best account to him of the birth of Christianity. He said, it's the only one that he finds persuasive. So I think that's a good point there. Here's point, let's go to number 6. Wait a minute, let me do one more thing about his point 5. He said, of all the miracles that are in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the resurrection is the hardest one for people to accept. He said people come up with all sorts of other ways, naturalistic ways to account for some of Jesus' healings, may have been psychosomatic or paranormal, and exorcisms, maybe it was just the power of suggestion, but you can't take the resurrection and strip it of its supernatural evidence. It's the old idea that Jesus swooned on the cross and then he woke up in the tomb, felt good. But he said nobody really buys that anymore. He said once you believe that Jesus really rose from the dead, it's easier to believe the gospel stories about his other miracles and that they have a solid basis in fact and are not just early Christian fiction. Here's point number 6. It's reasonable to believe that the gospel miracles actually happened, but it can't be proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. He said it's reasonable. He said it accounts for things. He said from the perspective of a theist, and he's a theist, he says, but reasonableness and proof are not the same thing. There's no way I can prove Jesus actually did miracles or actually rose from the dead. But nobody can prove that he didn't either. History doesn't allow for such proof. You just have to have I'd call it an inference to the best explanation, right? You're not going to get proof outside of mathematics. You can have reasonableness and probability, but proof is different. So when somebody tells you to prove to them that Jesus rose from the dead, they're putting a standard that they shouldn't have. Nobody should have to reach that standard. All you have to convince them is 51% of the time they believe it, right? Then it seems probable to them. Point 7. The skepticism of a lot of scholars regarding the historicity of the Gospels is rooted, why? In the denial of the possibility of miracles. Now remember, he said before that if you're a theist, you can at least entertain the possibility that there's some miracles, but if you're not a theist, if you don't think there's a God, you have a huge problem with the Gospels. You can say that somehow Jesus psychosomatically healed and things like that, but you're stuck with Gospels that narrate events that you don't think could happen. He said, this is Mark Roberts speaking, he said, I'm not offended by a scholar who comes along and says, I don't believe in God, so then I don't believe in the possibility of miracles, and so therefore I don't believe the gospel accounts are true. He said, okay. He said, I disagree with that person, but he said, I respect them. They're being reasonable and forthright. But he says, I'm less happy with scholars who don't acknowledge that their atheism is driving their scholarship. Isn't that interesting? Good way to put it. So he said, they don't admit their core beliefs, but they do scholarship with the assumption that God isn't miraculously involved in human affairs. So he said, all he asks for is just more honesty and self-awareness on the part of all scholars. He said, if you accept the possibility of miracles and you see the Gospels as accurate, then fess up. But if you deny the possibility of miracles and you deny it because of your prior assumption that the gospel accounts could be truthful, right? So if you deny it and it's based on your philosophy rather than the evidence, you should admit that as well. So that's the chapter that Roberts covers on miracles and whether it undermines the reliability of the Gospels. And I don't think miracles do undermine, and he doesn't either. So this is Mark Roberts' book. I think you would enjoy it. You can probably tell it's very conversational, easy to read, and I think you'd gain something out of it. And it's been around a while. So my guess is you could find it maybe at a used bookstore someplace. It came out in 2007. But the basic information doesn't go out of date. So I hope you have a chance to pick up a copy sometime. All right. Well, thanks for being part of this podcast.